Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to yet another episode in our series now, the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hours series, focusing on the REINS Act in focus, as it were. I'm your host, Andrew Langer, and joining us right now is someone I haven't had the privilege of interviewing yet for the big podcast, and we need to do that. But I'm a huge fan of his work, huge fan of the organization he works for. His name is Dr. Adrian Moore. He is the Vice President of Policy for the Reason Foundation. And what I love about having you on, Adrian, is that Reason presents a very unique perspective in all of this. Why is the REINS Act important to you? Why should it be important to the rest of us?
It's not very often that. Well, let me rephrase that. Congress has talked about doing something to change the way regulations are promulgated by agencies without congressional oversight. I don't know, 20 years? I think it's been about 20 years.
Yeah.
They've been rolling out these things and they haven't done anything. The fact that some people at least think that this one's got legs, that's right there is super exciting because, things like the Chevron case and some other things that have happened in the last couple of years, Loper Bright and so on have exposed, I think, to a much broader audience of folks than the usual regulatory nerds that we have a system that's got some real serious problems when it comes to how federal regulations get made.
Well, what I appreciate about Reason is that you guys call balls and strikes, both the foundation and the magazine, and that side of it as well. But at the foundation, you guys are good about calling balls and strikes. And one of the things I've been focusing on with regards to this REINS Act discussion is that if you are concerned about overarching executive branch power, concentration of power within the federal executive branch, then this should be important to you, regardless of what your team is, regardless of what flag you wave, what jersey you're wearing, right? If the other guy's in power and they're wearing the jersey, then you should be interested in this, and you should be interested in this as a general precept. Talk about that. Talk about the problem of concentrated power in the executive branch and why Democrats and Republicans alike should both be interested in this.
Yeah. I mean, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but the current process is basically, Congress passes a law that includes some language that says, there should be some regulations regarding X, right? And that has become sort of a blank check to federal agencies to decide what the scope of that is, define all of the relevant terms, and then create rules, punishment, prison sentences, fines, you name it, for these things, none of which was ever considered by Congress. And there's a couple of problems with that. What the REINS Act would do would basically, really oversimplifying, it would say, hey, when these agencies make rules, Congress has to approve them before they go into effect. It also, existing rules have to be run by Congress, and Congress has to give them the thumbs up for them to remain in place. It's kind of a sunset provision over 10 years. All existing regulations have to get a review by Congress. But the sort of my big caveat to my support for this overall idea is neither federal agencies nor Congress have a meaningful analytical framework by which to judge whether a regulation is good, bad, or indifferent.
Sure.
So the fact that Congress is going to pile on means we're maybe less likely to get bad regulations.
Yeah.
It's also going to politicize a lot of the regulations. So, Lord knows what will happen with that process. But I'm not confident that we're going to get better economic and scientific analysis of these regulations because neither group is super good at that.
It's interesting. I had this conversation yesterday with someone who's a former OIRA not administrator, but a former OIRA senior person to talk about that issue, whether or not we do need some kind of greater independent economic analysis. Some of this is done by the Office of Advocacy at the SBA. Some of this is done by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. Neither of which does I mean, they both do good jobs. I want to be really clear.
Right.
Not casting aspersions, but on the other hand, they don't have the resources that they might otherwise need. I would also add into this mix the National Ombudsman for Small Business because I'm
Right.
working on making some recommendations in that regard. I mean, do we need as part of a general? I mean, I'll ask you this as a general precept. Is it time to examine the Administrative Procedure Act and maybe as part of that, as we have if we look at the Administrative Procedure Act as a way of normalizing and standardizing the process by which statutes get interpreted and become regulation, do we need some kind of an analog in terms of the analysis of the economic impact of regulations and the establishment of some other office, or is that just a bureaucratic solution to a bureaucratic problem?
A little bit of both.
Yeah.
It on its face, it's crazy that we pass laws and then promulgate regulations that have vast economic
Right.
impacts without always doing a full analysis. Or, like you say, there are agencies that do analyze these things,
Right.
and there are many reports. They get read by a dozen. They're not binding,
Yeah.
so the regulators don't have to change their regulations just because there's an economic analysis. Congress doesn't have to change its law just because there's an economic analysis. So, uh, this gives both parties free rein to sort
Mm.
of do whatever they are going to do anyway, regardless of the analysis. I mean, if we had something that was a little more, had more teeth, we would also need to narrow the scope. I mean, part of the problem is you can't analyze every law and regulation when you're passing thousands and thousands of laws and regulations you'd have to have millions of people in the bureaucracy do that. And so until we rein in the scope of what Congress is legislating and what regulators are regulating, it is kind of unrealistic to expect deep analysis of all of them. And I think the problem is on the too many laws and regulations and not the let's just forego analysis because it gets in the way of our important business of passing rules.
Right, right. I mean, this is akin to the line from the movie Clerks. This job would be great if it wasn't for all the blankety blank customers, right? I mean,
Right, right,
that's
exactly.
this is the issue at hand here, and that's just it, right? The expression of the size and scope of federal power is in some measure, the economic impacts therein. We had a conversation this morning with Damian Brady from the National Taxpayers Union, who made the point, CBO scores a lot of these statutes. They're supposed to score all these statutes when they, right?
Right.
For those of you listening, Adrian just rolled his eyes. They score them, but at the end of the day, a CBO score on the Clean Water Act in 1972 overall has very little relevance. I literally said relevance.
Yeah.
Relevance 53 years later, and certainly that gets to the issue of how they interpret what a navigable water of the United States is. So so much. I mean, and I've gotten far afield
Yeah.
here. Let me sort of bring it back because as we're talking about the REINS Act, this issue, we are now starting to talk once again about regulatory budgeting. Our colleague Wayne Cruz, the Competitive Enterprise
Yeah.
Institute, will tell you, this is the job of Congress. It's not supposed to be up to the agencies to measure the costs and benefits of regulation, except we've done this. Anyway, your thoughts here overall
You're absolutely.
about that
Yeah.
farrago of
Yeah,
words.
no, I mean, yeah, Wayne's been pushing on that forever, and
Yeah.
it's true. And we've written a few pieces talking about the challenge of like managing, like let's say you want to, let's say everybody in this country gets serious about the debt and the deficit and getting spending to align with revenue and getting rid of the ongoing deficits and paying down the debt. The challenge is the mechanisms that people propose to do that. Like, let's say we did a federal, Tabor, where it was actually we passed a constitutional amendment that said the budget has to be balanced
Right.
every year. Well, hey, Congress has got a great work around that. They just don't put it in the budget anymore. They put it in the regulations.
Right.
You can impose all kinds of costs and collect all kinds of revenue without passing a law through the current regulatory process. So it's a huge, it's like if you squeeze the balloon animal in one part, another
Right.
part just gets
Sure.
bigger, right? And so something that actually constrains things is the first principle that solves ultimately these regulatory overreach
Right.
problems.
There are no silver bullets, but we
Yeah.
have to sort of go down there. Listen, as I've said, I haven't said it in this series, right? I used to say the most well-intentioned policies eventually bump up against very real realities. My dad said that's
Right.
much too complicated. He said there are many roads to utopia, however, all must traverse the surface of the earth. And I think we have to look realistically that it starts with getting the members of Congress. And before I let you go, I mean, let's talk about this. You know, you're right. There's an added political dimension that is at work here. And it's even more of a problem in an environment in which members of Congress don't want to do their jobs, right? The the Supreme Court decides Loper Bright, gets rid of the Chevron doctrine, and members of Congress immediately file a bill called the Stop Corporate Capture Act to put
Right.
that power back in the executive branch. I mean, that's the nasty truth in all this, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, because they're busy politicking,
Right.
and the actual mechanics of governance is a distraction from politicking. And so, trying to force that back onto their
Wow.
plate. I mean, the best thing that the REINS Act would accomplish would simply force more daylight into the process. Right now, most of this happens in a federal rulemaking process that a handful of people participate in and follow. And it's a very quiet process.
Yeah.
If Congress has got to approve all these things, there's lots of chances to stop silly stuff. The law itself allows things like, you mentioned the waters of the United States. Like the
Yeah.
classic thing is, if an individual would reasonably interpret the language of a congressional piece of legislation to not cover the drainage ditch in their backyard, and then a federal agency says, no, we interpret that law to cover the drainage ditch, you can go to court and say, wait a minute, does a reasonable person
Right.
interpret this law as
Right.
including a drainage ditch? So that's got to help, right? That's got to help.
Yes. Melissa, my favorite. I used this the other day. Back in 2015, remember the Clean Water Act when it was passed said that it wasn't going to regulate regular farming activity, which included disking. And somebody at EPA said, well, we can regulate the runoff from mountain ranges, so let's just declare these disked fields to be mini mountain ranges, and therefore, thankfully, that was proposed. It never went anywhere.
Right.
Adrian,
Wow.
how do folks find out more about the good work you guys are doing at the Reason Foundation?
Yeah, you can go to reason.org. That's where all of our policy work is. And if you want to read our journalism, which is much more broadly focused, you can go to reason.com.
Reason.org, reason.com. Our guest has been Dr. Adrian Moore, the Vice President of Policy at the Reason Foundation. Thank you so very much for joining us. We got to get you back.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you all for joining us on this special series from the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour podcast, The REINS Act in Focus. I've been your host, Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.